welcome to section 9.1. The topic is on gender theory for youth, and this is coming from the book Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria, A Catholic Response. I'm Dr. Thibault. This is a study guide for the book, so if you want to get more of the detail and the bibliography and all of the other resources that come with it, it's important to get the book. A link is in the description. This is just to kind of give a summary for you, and maybe for some people who aren't going to get the book, some direction. Okay, when we're dealing with gender dysphoria and gender ideology, one of the hot button areas is on the topic of youth. Now, gender ideology people tend to say, why are the conservatives so obsessed with children? Right? Why are they so obsessed with what people are doing with their bodies and what kids are doing? And then the conservative sides gets upset that the transgender activists, the gender ideology people, are aiming this at children, right? It's one thing when Bruce Jenner becomes Caitlyn Jenner, but when you want to teach this ideology, the ideological aspect of this to kindergartners or fourth graders, right? This is the problem. So this is a very hot button topic. So wherever you are on this topic when you watch this video, this might upset you. So, I try to balance the middle ground of this with the Catholic response. I think though this section tends to lean a bit more conservative, so if you're wondering where it's going. Now, N.T. Wright, who's the Anglican bishop, he wrote, this involves, and he's talking about gender ideology, this involves denying the goodness or even the ultimate reality of the natural world. Nature, however, tends to strike back, with the likely victims, in this case, being vulnerable and impressionable youngsters who, as confused adults, will pay the price for their elders' fashionable fantasies. This, because you could see it would not be that popular with gender ideology people, but I think there's some wisdom in there. This is other great quotes at the beginning of the chapters, God always forgives, man sometimes forgives, nature never forgives, right? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. You can't mess with nature without nature fighting back, right? This is what people say with climate change. It's what you say with vaccines, right? If you mess around with nature, you'll pay a price, right? Now, where does this come from? Well, this really comes from modernism. This is the Enlightenment. We're still in a Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment era, and it comes with a certain level of idealism, right? If we think back to World War II, especially, right? This is quite a few years after the philosophical principle of modernism started. But, if you look at the architecture, World War II architecture, post-World War II architecture, we went from pre-World War II, primarily, you had classical architecture. If you look at universities, they often had Gothic arches. They were made out of brick or stone. They had design to them, cornices, right? There was proportion and balance and harmony, and they often modeled them off of European images of classical Catholic architecture, right? Some Catholic universities often had kind of an ecclesiastical design to them for their kind of nobility of what they were supposed to do. Churches as well the Catholic Church has its own architecture, the Gothic architecture. We also have the Romanesque architecture, and we have our own design, right? And it's supposed to raise the mind to higher ideals, right? This is part of the idea with this type of architecture, right? So we went from this kind of idealism and aiming towards a heavenly pursuit, right, to a very anti-idealist, well, maybe anti-realist approach in the post-World War period. You start seeing all of these schools and architectures being made just giant boxes, just raw cement, no design, no detailing, no arches, no classical elements. We're dealing with rationalism, right? And you go into a classroom of schools made in this 1960s, 70s, and even through the 80s and 90s even, you see these architectural types where you walk into a classroom and there's no windows or there's no design whatsoever, right? The idea was, well, we're going to not try to distract people, right? We're going to try to make it so that all they see is the teacher in the community, right? So we're not distracted by the building. Same thing with church architecture, right? It's this idea of, well, let's not get distracted with the windows and the arches and the ceilings and the artwork and the statues and the altar and all that. This is all distracting from the key activity, which is a communal meal, right? This is kind of a 1960s, 70s approach to things, right? 80s, 90s even, right? It's about the communal meal. It's about the community. It's not about the building, right? So we whitewashed it all. And ironically, I had a newborn child that I was raising with foster care. I'd bring him to church, and there's one church we went into that was fairly untouched from Vatican II, and he was silent in the church. He was in awe. He was just looking at the windows and looking at the lights and looking at all the different things. He was very busy while we were there, just taking it all in. Go into a church that had been heavily modified during Vatican II, and there's not much in there, and he's bored and he's restless and he's not well behaved. That's the irony of it, right? So should we be distracted at Mass or in the classroom? Not really, right? The goal isn't to be distracted, but if you do get distracted, to stare at a beautiful stained glass window which elevates your mind to God is not a bad way to be distracted, right? To be distracted in the classroom and to see a beautiful portrait on the wall or something is not necessarily a bad distraction. So, we have these idealisms, right? Well, this is what a church should be, right? This is what an academic building can be, right? At the same time, they're tearing down parts of the city and putting up highways, interstate highways, cutting neighborhoods apart, right? Even before World War II. Because this idea of the community, right? Building these large housing towers to put elderly people in and people in these towers, and they become these monuments of misery. Like nobody wants to live in these towers, right? But we're destroying organic neighborhoods to create, the idea, right? It's the idea of community, the idea of school, the idea of religion. And it has thrown out all of the organic structures which had evolved over 1,000 years, right? More than 1,000 years. This is the modernist ideal, right? It frees us from reality, and it aligns us with ideology, which inevitably fails, right? This is part of the failure of the modernist ideal, right? If you go to a city in Europe, right, where do you want to go? You want to go to the old city, right? If you go to Belgium, where do you go when you go to Belgium? Do you go to Brussels? Probably not unless you're there for business, right? You go to Bruges, you go to Ghent, you go to Leuven, you go to these places. These are the beautiful places, right? The ones that have been the least touched by modernism, the more desirable they are, right? This is even in Providence, Rhode Island, where I'm from, we have the old colonial section of the city. That's the most expensive section of the city. The stuff from the 1700s is more valuable than the stuff from the 1970s, right? Because they had detail and classic design, and and an organic nature to them, right? Houses that are built kind of right on top of other houses, no room for a driveway or anything like that. There's an organic nature to it, right? People are drawn to the organic nature. They're not drawn to this type of modernist idealism that is unnatural, and that's the key to modernism. It tries to put the mind and the individual above the idea of nature and the common good, right? It's part of these elements. Now, when we have applied this to society in general, it's clear that we also have applied this to children, right? We applied it to education. We applied it to child raising. John Money is a notable person in this area where he kind of coined terms like gender and kind of differentiated gender and sex. And he has this idea, right? We've already covered John Money, but as a repeat, a little bit of a repeat. He thought that gender is really entirely socially constructed, that there is no difference between men and women, that it's just social construction. So if a boy is born with a birth defect, a sexual birth defect, just turn the little boy into a little girl, raise him as a girl, and he will be a girl, because there is no difference between boys and girls other than the nurture element of this. So if you raise him as a girl, he will be a girl psychologically, right? Gender is kind of a way of thinking of psychological sex. But this turned out to be a giant failure, but it took decades to realize just how big of a failure and how wrong he was, right? It took 20, 30 years to figure this out. In the meantime, he was kind of praised as cutting edge and inventive and correct, right? And for at least 20 years, he's known as being correct. His opinion is correct. And everything else kind of uses it as a foundation for its approach to sex and gender, right? So the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, there's this approach that sex is just a social construct and gender is a social construct, right? Everything is built on this, and it's wrong, right? So everything's built on a wrong ideology. You would think, though, since it's been discredited, right? In his studies where he had done this, we now know that the little boys he turned into little girls did not successfully stay as little girls, right? And sometimes that ending in suicide. It was so unsuccessful. People like Gina Rippon, PhD, I've mentioned her in the past, she says things like, there is no such thing as a male or female brain type, and instead the brain is a plastic organ shaped and molded by experiences in which childhood is key. This is 2017, right? This is a decade after we've realized John Money was entirely wrong. She's still telling the same story, right? By plastic brain, they don't mean a Barbie doll brain. They just mean plastic as in moldable and changeable, right? So saying that the brain is moldable, changeable, it's changed by experiences, particularly in your childhood. Therefore, you make the mind, the parent makes the mind of their child. It's not innate, right? It's not part of who they are. Other feminists jump on to Gina Rippon's argument, saying a neuroscientist brilliantly debunks the notion of a female brain could do more for the gender equality than a number of feminist manifestos. So the feminism, right, second wave feminism, says there's no difference between the male or female brain. It's all socially constructed. Gina Rippon, as a neuroscientist, says, yes, that is correct, and the feminists run with it. But is it correct? It doesn't seem like it is correct. We don't think it is correct, right? There is a difference. There is a sexual differentiation between other primates, right? Chimpanzees, gorillas. There's sexual differentiation between male and female. Why would we be the only primates that do not have sexual differentiation between male and female? Are we different than all the other primates, right? Probably not, right? Probably not. And we've discussed this a bit earlier in chapter 2 with the topic of sex and gender, but it's relevant again here, specifically how it applies to children. So the English are particularly, they love this. So Gina Rippon being English, Rachel Cook English, Javid, I know I think he's Indian. It's a very long last name. I won't butcher it. Javid works with Gina Rippon in creating this program for schools in England. They documented it in the BBC. It's called No More Boys and Girls, Can Our Kids Go Gender Free? It's this whole experiment. You can watch it on YouTube if you want. But it's about trying to undo the sexual differences between boys and girls. You know, you're not going to say, boys and girls, take your seats, right? You're not going to make anything different for boys or girls. You're going to treat students entirely the same in the classroom, which is typically feminine, right? Sit still, sit quiet, do your work, which is a feminine way of learning, right? Go back to brain science when we did the difference between the male and female brain. These are skills that are better fit for females than for males. Males learn more with tactile, touching, learning, experiencing. They're more experiential in their learning. Females are better learners when it comes to language, right? So a teacher can sit in front of the classroom and give a lecture, and a female student can sit quietly and listen and learn. Very difficult for males. That's not typically how the male brain works. That men can never learn anything, but it's not what comes most natural to them, right? So I won't go into great detail into that experiment, but it ended up getting thrown out. Not that that was proof that it didn't work. I think it didn't work because it's contrary to 800 million years of human evolution, right? Dr. Helena Cronin says this, another English Darwinist in London. She says that 800 million years of human evolution have more to do with male and female behavior than the socialization they get when they're 5 years old. Right. Michael Gurian, who's an educational specialist, and he's not talking about the transgender issue. It's not his area, so I don't want anything of this to get pushed onto him. But he is a specialist when it comes to male and female education and how boys are getting left behind in education because boys and girls think and interact with the world differently. They act differently, right? So some of the things he has pointed out is boys earn most of the D's and F's as high as 70% of the time. Boys make up 80% of the disciplinary problems. 70% of children with learning disabilities are boys. 80% of the children on Ritalin are boys. Young men are between a year and a half behind most girls in reading and writing skills. 80% of high school dropouts are men, and men comprise 44% of the college population, which means that women make up a higher percentage of the college population. All to say, boys and girls are different, right? There's a statistical difference between boys and girls and the way their minds work and the way that they interact with school and knowledge and information and socially, right? There's a difference between them. It's simply saying, well, all the boys act more like girls and you'll be successful in school. Well, this is probably why there's so much failure of boys in school. This is Michael Gurian's response is we need to teach boys in the way the boys need to learn, right? And maybe tomboys, girls that learn the same way, they might be able to benefit from it too. And some boys might want to learn the way that girls typically learn. But we should respect that there are differences. If boys learn better outside and with their hands and more rough and tumble, do it that way. Why not, right? I brought this example up before, but I had a foster son who had been through 5 different foster homes as a teenager. He needed some mental health treatment to help process all of this. Bringing him to a therapist, though, feminine therapists were typically female, mostly middle-aged women, and they would say, sit down in the chair, and she would say, so tell me, what are your problems? It must be, and she would tell him how he must feel. You must feel like this, and he'd sit there and he'd go, mm-hmm. He wouldn't. He had nothing to say. He had nothing to interact with. He didn't communicate, and they would let him go after one session. He said, "Well, he doesn't really want to be here, so I can't get any. I can't be of any help." However, if you take the same boy and you put him in the gym and put him with something athletic, slightly athletic or active, and you say, hey, what do you think about this? Or what do you think about that? Or what's going on with this? He wouldn't shut up, right? But he could access his verbal skills and his emotions better when he was physically active, manipulating objects, right? Lifting weights, jogging, playing basketball, whatever it is. Physical activity and communication works. Sitting quietly in a chair and listening to this woman did not work, right? Because boys and girls are different, right? This is the premise. We also learn this when it comes to toys, and there's been a move to make gender-neutral toys. Right? Why should the dolls be for girls? Why should the girls' playhouses be for girls? Why should the G.I. Joe action figures be aimed at boys? Right? Why are there boys and girls toys? Aren't children just children? Right? That's the claim. So Hasbro, as an example of a toy company, they tried to come up with a gender-neutral playhouse. But when they put it through the testing, they found that girls played house in the dollhouse, and boys would launch trucks off the roof of the dollhouse because little boys act like boys and little girls act like girls. Just how it is. Christina Hoff-Summers, she reported, Hasbro managers came to a startling conclusion: boys and girls are different. Right, and there are many examples of this. Right, Pope Francis, he has something to say about this too. And in a 2015 general audience, he said, this is an exact quote: "I ask myself, if this is so, gender theory is not, at the same time, an expression of frustration and resignation, which seeks to cancel out sexual differences because it no longer knows how to confront it. The removal of differences creates a problem, not a solution." Right? So part of this gender theory, are people gender dysphoric, particularly children? Is a little girl saying, I'm a boy, a little boy saying, I'm a girl. Is this not maybe an expression of a frustration and a resignation about our society's approach to male and female, right? And to say, well, let's just go gender free. This, he says, is not the solution. It's to allow little girls to be fully little girls and to allow little boys to be fully little boys. Stop telling boys how they should be, stop telling girls how they should be, and allow them to be, right? On one side, you have the conservative approach, which say, well, I'm going to make my little boy act like a boy, right? He's going to hunt and play baseball, and he's going to do X, Y, Z, because that's boy activity. Girls are going to do this, right? That's a conservative approach, which is perhaps sometimes ideological and unnatural. On the conservative side, on the liberal side, you have people who say, oh, this little boy likes to play with dolls, therefore he must be gay or he must be a woman, right? This is equally unhelpful, right? You're trying to just allow them to be them, right? If a little boy wants to play with a doll, let him play with a doll. If a little boy wants to play with G.I. Joe, let him play with G.I. Joe. This is not a big deal, right? Pope Francis has said this many ways in many different times, so